Liminal. Written by Super Duper Starry. Read by Arashi. The first time Dimitri woke all the way, he faced a pitted sky, black and void. He heard the snap of feet on stone and shook away his drowsiness, then lurched back at the touch of skin. Fingers. Someone had cupped his face. "Dimitri." A warm, steady tone. He attempted to place it. "How are you feeling?" Too warm, too bright to be deduced. Masculine and kind. He envisioned his closest compatriots and could not fit his voice into any of their throats. They knew his name. They cared for him. That was prevalent enough. He tried to remember what had come before his dark eve, but he could only taste iron and envision red. Screams echoed from everywhere. In his head or real? He could not recall. "Dimitri." Again, gently urging. He knew this voice. Knew it well. It fluttered just beyond a transparent veil. If he could just reach out and snatch it. A disgruntled gasp rewarded him when he gripped the front of what he assumed was their shirt. "My, your strength hasn't waned in the slightest since your little soiree with the Weeper. I'll take that as a good sign." Claude. The name fell into Dimitri's mouth like a ripe fruit. Refreshing and sweet and sudden, and not at all right. He surged to his feet and batted Claude away. Claude's hands remained, holding him up in a state like worship. "Where have you taken me?" the fallen king rasped. His voice trembled when he spoke, dripping off his cracked lips. Captive? Was he the Duke of Leicester's captive? Still, he could not see. He blinked rapidly. Claude's hands were in the way, a poor mimicry of surprise. He backed away, ripping himself out of Claude's reach. His eyes struggled to adjust. "I'm not sure myself," Claude responded. "Somewhere east of Gronder Field." Gronder. The sound of it brought down Dimitri's spine frigid pinpricks. Fires had painted the horizon, setting the sky aflame with orange. Blood drenched the ground, and after slip and fall in, Ingrid's outstretched hand beckoned in front of him moments before an arrow shot her Pegasus to the ground, and she had fell. Hard, crying out. Out of sight. He had lost Adu. He was searching. He was not finding him anywhere. The fear was rising up in his throat like a bile. "Why?" Dimitri croaked. His voice shook. Claude let out a sardonic chuckle. "You're the only person I found intact as I retreated. I would have searched more, but the mere act of securing you on my wyvern caused me to black out." Another laugh. What a joke. "She brought us this far before she—" Claude swallowed, sharply enough for him to hear, clawing his hands over his eyes, warding away the darkness. Dimitri growled. This fool had separated him from his friends, his people. It would be a monumental task to recover them. Already, the voices were stirring at the base of his skull, begging for vengeance, the only salve that could cool the sting of fire at their heels. Lost in purgatory, only he could save them. He would save them. Treading abruptly, he tromped forward. The dirt under his worn feet was barren, scratchy. On its edges, he felt rocks, and kept to the soft pile in the middle. The sky was still dark, blindingly so. "Dimitri!" Claude called at his heels. "Where are you going?" "I must rebuild my army," he replied. "They're dead," Claude bit out. "Dead or too wounded to be of any assistance." A pause. "You're wounded." So his limp wasn't imagined. "I must find Adu," he said. "Adu saved my life. I have yet to save his this time. We don't know where any of them have gone. If he even survived the battle." Claude let out a frustrated sigh. "Believe me, I've been calculating since I could walk again. I don't know where my own army is. I think it's—" "Why did you separate me from them?" Dimitri turned heel and bumped straight into Claude. Curse this darkness. Claude gripped him, his palms burning with sweat. "Would you have rather died with them?" "I cannot die until I have avenged—" "By all means! It's very likely you would have been dead if I hadn't found you." Claude held back a scoff. "Dimitri, your war is suicide." "Let me go." He strained against Claude, found himself lacking. The smolder drained from his complexion. "After everything I went through to bring you back, let me go. You're the only person I've located between each of our arms. Let me go." They both panted in silence. Then Claude said, "You're walking in the wrong direction." Dimitri roared, wrenching himself from Claude's hold. He breathed heavily and shouted, "Damn this darkness!" "Darkness?" Claude blurted. "The sun's right there, on the horizon." Dimitri opened his mouth, and no words came out. Slowly, his hand staggered towards his own face. He rubbed it where he knew his eyes to be. The right was still scarred, as it had been since he was run out of his own kingdom. The left did not feel wrong. A substance that had to be blood caked it, but so much as he blinked and pried at it, the light of day refused to greet him. His breaths lengthened. Shaken, he felt himself fall to his knees, as if his soul was merely attached to his body by a cord. He cupped his face in his hands. There was no light. The very sun had forsaken him. As his breaths grew deeper, weaker, they gained sound, and his exhales malformed into moans of sheer agony. He could not see. He could not see. There would be no leading an army, no defending his friends' lives, nor recovering any of them, if he could not see. There would be no Edelgard's head to present to his phantoms, if he could not even locate it. His breath dragged against the back of his throat like a blade. He coughed and covered his mouth with his sinful hands. He did not realize he had curled up until those familiar warm palms flanked his side. He let himself be gathered into Claude's willing arms, hating himself, even as he gave in. "I have lost all my sight," he said plainly, so Claude could hear it. Claude winced. "I'm sorry." "Indeed," he replied. There was nothing else to say. It felt safe to cry against Claude's chest. Nowhere else had he allowed himself. There was always a barrier encircling him, like a leash to his throat, tugging him backwards. But now, he had nothing. He had no kingdom, no people, no friends, no vassal, no means of securing his revenge. He may as well have never been a king. After the tears had already cut down his cheeks, he realized Claude was the same. They had little aside from the very clothes on their backs, and one another. They did not even know whether Edelgard had won that battle. She must have. They were nobody now. "Why?" he rasped, allowing Claude's sternum to pillow his head. "I don't know." Claude's voice was quiet, intimate. "I guess your other eye was scarred down during the battle at some point." Dimitri shook his head, releasing a frustrated cry. "Why did you let me live?" He felt Claude's sharp, surprised inhale in his hair. "How could I leave you to die?" Claude did not understand. Dimitri shook his head, breathed out. His life would have been easier if he had ignored Dimitri's nearly corpse on the battlefield. What was there to live for now? Claude had to wash him if there was any hope of scrubbing away all of the grime. He'd prepared a whole list of reasons, but Dimitri merely shrugged, accepting his touch. He asked politely before undressing him, and his fingers softened wherever Dimitri grunted in pain. The water was cool, nearly calming, were it not between Claude's tender-hearted hands. Claude had to bandage his wounds. Dimitri tried, but his strength betrayed him, his tying sloppy, misshapen. Claude was gentle with him as he pulled the rags tight, securing what had yet to whiten and halo a scar. Claude was forced to take the lead when they began traveling eastward. He let Dimitri hold a fistful of his shirt. When Dimitri asked where he was taking him, Claude merely said, "Away from the battlefield." They lived off of foraged roots that Dimitri could explain to him, but could not find on his own. Their smell was particular. He noticed as he ate, but he had trouble distinguishing them from the faint stench of blood that seemed to have thickened over the atmosphere. At night, they lay in an abandoned barn's hayloft, or hollowed-out hideaway, wherever Claude could locate for them. With their faces to the stars, Dimitri could almost taste them. Claude held his hand through the dark after their first night, and Dimitri rolled over and woke abruptly, and couldn't find him, and began to panic, and cried out to the woods, and he was halfway across the forest before Claude caught up to him. The first time they came across a village, Claude pulled him aside, and carefully repositioned their rags in a manner that he declared would obscure their identities. "I'm your little foreign wife," he said. "My... what? I've got a headscarf on. Here." He took Dimitri's hand and led it to his head. Dimitri felt Claude's rough, bearded face. Then the surrounding headscarf that obscured all but his eyes. "With some of our extra rags, I've given myself some rather adorable skirts." Dimitri held back a bark of laughter. "Why have you decided to become my wife, Claude?" he could only ask. "You're my mysterious and brooding husband." He tapped the shroud that he'd tied over Dimitri's head, obscuring all but his lips. "See? 'Cause I'm foreign. I'm gonna pretend not to know the language, which should keep people from questioning us too thoroughly. Can you act vaguely religious? Religious people don't You're not religious. You just look mysterious and religious. It'll give off a sense of wonder and hopefully make us seem less conspicuous." "The way you describe it, Claude, we sound all the more conspicuous." "Oh, you!" he rattled off in nonsense language, his voice pitched high enough to suggest feminine. Dimitri blinked. "Perhaps it will work." Against all odds, it did. They walked arm in arm, Claude playing the part of the doting wife who dragged her husband all over to sightsee. He was admittedly quite skilled at it, reminding Dimitri of his paltry memories of his own mother. Dimitri only spoke when Claude elbowed him and whispered the price of food at a stall. When indicated, Claude would just giggle and babble in his nonsense language. They came out of it with food and some nicer clothes that fit like actual garments rather than curtains, provided by meager cash they had found on their way to the village. They had used their disguises 2 more times before Dimitri began to recognize the sounds Claude made in the village. "Those are words," he blurted, after they had departed and Claude had deemed it safe to speak. He unwrapped his arm from around Dimitri to pinch his sleeve, tug him forwards. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, coy as ever. Dimitri could imagine his wink. "What language is that?" he asked. "I apologize for assuming it was incoherent babble." "As you said, incoherent babble." Certainly not." He hesitated, gritting his teeth, then pronounced, poorly, the word he had heard. "What does it mean?" Claude tugged at him a little harder, hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "It's an expression. It doesn't quite translate into Fodland. It basically means silly husband, if we're speaking generally. It evokes the sense of a doting wife, or partner, who thinks their husband can do no wrong. Kind of old-timey. But I think it's cute." Dimitri thought very hard about it, before letting himself guess. "An Almiran phrase?" Claude drew carefully silent, guarded. It was a Claude he could recognize, a side of him he had not witnessed since long before the war. This Claude, the Claude who had saved his life, was unabashedly honest with him. There was no reason to be anything else. But the old Claude, the Claude who schemed and connived and doubted, still lived somewhere beneath his surface. There was a time when Dimitri had spied, poorly, on him, seeking to know his heart, sensing the barrier within his silence, almost felt like recognizing a long-lost friend. Dimitri could sense when it drew back, and the warm, forgiving Claude he had found after his revival returned. "Good guess. Yeah, it's Almiran." He was not sure how, but he could practically smell the prickling unease in the air between them. He could infer that Claude had never shown anyone so much of his past before. Nobody in Fodland, at least. Dimitri swallowed. "I like it," he said. "It's a pleasant phrase." He was blushing. Goddess, he was blushing. He could not stop blushing. Claude was laughing. Dimitri had since removed his veil. He was sure Claude could see everything. He cleared his throat. "Could you say it again?" he asked. "I would like to learn how to speak it." Claude chuckled. "Looking for a husband to dote on?" Dimitri blushed. Again. "Perhaps I am." The once ruler of Leicester had a musical laugh. "Maybe if we speak it loud enough, we'll summon one." "It is you," he could not bring himself to say. "You have saved me in so many ways that now I belong to you, and you alone." "East again?" Dimitri asked each morning. "East," Claude agreed. For weeks they traveled towards the sunrise with little but one another as company. They never ran into a familiar face. Not a one, only peasants and soldiers who had escaped the rapidly dwindling war. They would ask for news, but had come up almost entirely empty. It appeared that Edelgard was losing, forces bolstered around Enbar and other forts near the capital of Adrestia. But they were not near anyone close enough to the war to confirm it for them. They knew the professor had joined Seth's aid in the war, siding with the Church of Ceres to unite the land. They did not know how the war effort was spreading. It was safest to avoid it. So they did. Days and nights developed a routine. Sounds and scents had each begun to amplify. The ground was growing familiar to him. Early on in their travels, Dimitri had forsaken his shoes, as to feel the earth beneath his feet, and he could perceive textures now. He could smell an open wound from more paces away than Claude could readily see it. With each of these new discoveries, Claude would clap his shoulder and say, voice soft with awe, "You don't even need your sight any longer." Then the dreams would descend upon him. He would wake, coated in sweat, so confused, and he would surely run off in a rampage. If not for the hands securely threaded through his, it grounded him, Claude's fingers. They were slender, long, calloused by a bow. When Dimitri startled, too shaken from his dreams and the voices to speak, he would rub his companion's hand across his face. It showed him Claude was close, and would not be going anywhere any time soon. He smelled faintly of sage and jasmine. Dimitri wished he could smother himself with Claude's scent. He told Dimitri where they were going as they approached Goneril territory. They sat together in a hayloft, knees touching. The worn hay was becoming a comfort, unlike any bed he had ever slept in before. Claude explained his reasoning, thorough as ever. "We might be able to hide for some time in Fodland, but there's always a chance we'll be found. Wherever the war is headed, we aren't safe here. So, I was thinking it might be best if we left the country." He held each of Dimitri's hands as he spoke. He did it when he wanted all of Dimitri's attention. Simple, but highly effective. Claude hesitated, as the silence stretched on between them. His breaths were warm puffs of air on Dimitri's lips, his words close after. "I understand that you might not feel safe leaving. I don't ask you to come with me if you wouldn't like." "Do not fit words into my mouth," Dimitri said. Claude grew quiet but for the drags of his inhales, the slow pump of his heartbeat. "I do have trouble imagining it. Leaving behind the land of the goddess. To reject her. Reject them." He shut his eyes as the voices screamed over him. There were more these days. More every day. Claude sensed him tensing, squeezed his hands tighter. How Dimitri trembled before him. "But you are right that it would be safer for us to depart. And I—" He swallowed. His breaths were hot, threatening to choke him. "I cannot desert you." Claude let out a nervous laugh. "You can. I almost feel like you're better at navigating than me now." He was no longer afraid that Dimitri would throw his life away. He did not say. Dimitri shook his head. He gripped onto Claude's hands, rubbed it slowly against his cheek. Claude's sharp exhale punctured him like a knife. His body inched closer. The fallen king said, "I cannot. I owe you more." He squeezed his hand tighter. "Than I owe anyone else. Living." He had to pause, to find the courage to say it. "Or dead." The voices howled at him, but despite their chorus, they were not as loud as they once were. "If I am trying to live," he continued, "then I must pursue you, Dimitri. Else, I would not be truly living." He had heard Claude's breathing so often now that he could recognize it from anyone else's. One time they were separated in a marketplace, and he was able to follow him by scent and sound alone. Claude's breaths were the last and first sound he heard each morning. His days ended and began with him. Where would Dimitri go, if not after him? He feared the voices would take over, the souls of his brethren, and he would be crushed under their ravages. No. His grip tightened on Claude's hand, where it cupped his face. Dimitri hesitated. "I know I have been a burden to you for these months, so I understand if, for your sake, you would prefer if—" "No." Claude's voice wavered when he spoke again. "You have been my only companion for all of this time. I am certain I would have gone mad without you. You are no burden, Dimitri." He had wished for his sight many times, but he ached to have it now. For just a second, to see the vulnerable look in Claude's eyes, to see his mouth tremble, to see his tousled hair and boyish grin, and flushed cheeks. Releasing Claude's hand, he held his face to his fingers. The once Duke let out a quiet gasp. What he could not see of Claude's face, he touched. With his thumbs, he traced the curvature of his lips and his chin's scruffy edges, his dimples and his smile, the notch at his brow. Then he cradled his head in the hearts of his palms. He felt his pulse quavering beneath calloused skin. Claude leaned into his hold, and sighed so sweetly he could nearly taste it. Once he was satisfied, he lay down. Claude followed him, let out an almost reluctant exhale. His companion added, velvety, I have family ties in Elmira. I should let you know before we're there that I have a different name back home. Home, he admitted. Elmira was his home. He would see Claude's home. No, not Claude at all. What is it? Dimitri breathed. Your name? Khalid, he answered, breathless with honesty, like a wind that had been held back for so many years. Khalid, he repeated. Khalid. It was a good name. Then again, Dimitri would like to think that no matter what his name was. Dimitri cleared his throat. Which name do you prefer? His response was quiet, his silence steeped in unease. Khalid is the name I was given at birth. I came up with Claude to assimilate into Fodlan culture. Ah, Khalid, Dimitri answered. Khalid let out a weak laugh. That's me. It was not often that a looter or bandit would sneak into their residence of the night, but Dimitri would startle awake at their footsteps, pelted over the earth. Like rocks assaulting the ground, they smashed into floorboards and cracked open the doors. Its hinges would squeal in protest, and disgruntled, Dimitri would rise, grabbing his weapon from where he smelled its steel, and then he would listen to the prickle of oncoming footsteps and slice the intruder through their gut. Only then would Khalid wake. We have visitors? He asked, bleary with sleep. Something like that. Dimitri eased the lance out of the enemy's corpse. Once he had washed his hands of the deed, he would return to Khalid's side. Khalid's arms encircled his body. Instinct now. It had seemed foolish to ignore their wanting, when they had literally nothing to lose for it, and everything to gain. They did not speak of it until after it had already become habit. Once he crawled back to bed, his steps careful and measured as to not knock any of the furniture in the house husk. Khalid said through the darkness, I always admired you. Dimitri blushed, as his face was wont to do. He settled down beside Khalid, with enough space to lay a knife between them. Did you? Yeah, he said so casually. You're the strongest guy I know. You always fight with a passion, purpose, and you let nothing stop you. I wish I was brave like that. You're plenty brave, Dimitri chided. Khalid laughed like this was a great joke. I second-guess everything I do. I haven't stopped thinking for a moment about Gronder. About what I did wrong. About if Hilda or any of my classmates are alive to even remember my mistakes. You are smarter than me, Dimitri mumbled. Khalid snorted. It is true. I didn't think to question my assault. On Gronder, or any other battlefront, I would seek my prey, and I would kill it. He swallowed. And that way of thinking almost killed me. You're safe now, Khalid said to make it palatable. As are you, Dimitri replied. Khalid started to say something, then stopped. You cannot be so forgiving to me, Dimitri continued. If you refuse to grant yourself the same mercy, you deserve it more than I. Oh, stop, Khalid said. Your own kingdom tried to usurp you. I think that gives you more than enough leeway for... You stop, Dimitri said, like a child. I dislike how cruel you are to yourself. I'm not... Yes, you are! You are! Khalid was laughing softly. He was too. I'm not! If you want to blame yourself for anything, let it be for that you are the reason I remain here before you, alive and well enough to call you out for doubting the goodness within you. Khalid sputtered. But you're... The only way to cut him off definitively was with his mouth. He overshot and pecked Khalid's cheek first, but a different sort of sputter escaped him at the sensation. Then he cupped Dimitri's face and redirected him, kissing him fiercely. A soft moan pulled at him. He curled his arms round Khalid and held him close enough to feel his heart pounding frantically against his. When they broke apart, Dimitri gasped, whispered, Were you plotting this all along? Khalid's cold breath traced his cheek. I wish. And then they laughed and kissed again. They purchased a wyvern from House Goneril. Dimitri waited, heart hammering, for Hilda's older brother to recognize them as the lost kings they were. Yet somehow, They paid and retrieved the beast, undeterred. Khalid laughed throughout the entire endeavor. It wore Dimitri's nerves. Once they were in the heavens, it was anyone's bet whether Khalid's lost headscarf, fluttering past his cheek, revealed him to the house below, or whether Dimitri's yelps of panic gave him away. But after they went over the first mountain, he could only hear the silence of the mountainous peaks. It was a reverent silence, of things greater and older than them by millennia. The last of their journey was largely spent in the sky. Khalid drove the wyvern with the ease and sleight of a master. They decided to name the beast Rhea, after the one and only. Khalid thought it deeply amusing. Dimitri did not realize where they were headed as they trekked across unfamiliar land, past homes built with mud and sandstone. The desert accompanied them northward, until they reached a castle larger than even Fargus's. They drowned in its massive spired shadow, giving him cause to shiver. And just like that, Khalid linked his arms and helped him up the stairs. "You know," he was saying, in that casual way of his, "you might yet become a king, Dima." What? What? That was the only warning before the Queen and King of Elmira descended upon them, smothering Khalid in kisses, and asking so many questions in a language Dimitri could barely understand. They prodded Dimitri, and bickered with Khalid in quick flashes of Elmiran. He could recognize the word they used to describe him, which was horribly embarrassing. The people of Elmira judged him with their silence, a judgment he figured he had earned. He stuck to Khalid's shadow like a lost animal. Khalid indulged him, hand always in his. When he had time, he would help Dimitri wander through the castle as he began to learn the feeling of its pathways. He came to recognize its endless twists and turns. Khalid's mother apparently loved him, for some reason. She was the only person he could hold a conversation with. It seemed inevitable that she would teach him the Elmiran language. She had far more patience than he was worth, but he was becoming used to that as well. There was another man whose voice he began to recognize. Nader, Khalid called him, and an honorific he could not yet place. Nader's presence was punctuated by a deep, rasping laugh and strong, calloused hands. He offered to train with Dimitri when he was around, and he would comment on his fighting style. He spoke Fodlan like a native. His laugh was a deeper shadow of Khalid's. "Kiddo," he would say, "you are very impressive. You fight in a terrifying manner I don't think I've seen anywhere else." His blindness, he realized, had become in a ways a boon. How strange. Their halls were full of sun and mirth and echoing laughter. He would run his fingers over the corridors' engraved paintings, and marvel at the beauty of the place he never would have thought he had the chance to seek, had life not worked out just so. He found he loved it. He would wake up and shudder, so overcome with adoration that he was almost convinced he had imagined it. But each day he would wake with Khalid wrapped around him securely, nearly impossible to maneuver away from without both of them tumbling onto the floor. And surely he did not imagine that, nor the babble of his siblings, many older than Khalid. They picked on Dimitri at first, making japes he could not understand. But after one translated that they wished to duel him, thinking him easy prey, he was promptly thrown onto his back. They fell in love with him, and fought for his attention. Not even the phantoms could follow him this far. They withered under the brutal yet loving Elmiran sun, finally granting him space to think for himself, to breathe. He was finally drawn to the balconies that ringed the high castle walls. On evenings, he would stand before them and listen to the lively bustle of civilians, soldiers, royalty, and children, all entangled together. The sheer vicinity of their people was so wonderful, and so different from the cold, barren corridors and cities of the grey lands he had come from. It astounded him each night. Khalid cornered him on one such eve, months after his return home. Dimitri heard him in his gate, and smiled. "Yes?" he called. Khalid took to his side. "I have a proposition for you," he said. Dimitri could only snort, brows raised. He felt for Khalid's hand, took it. Khalid leaned into him. His love spoke softly, each word honed from crystal. "You may recall my proposal that you could still become king again one day." Goddess, how this man made him laugh. He shook his head, his smile indefatigable. "What sort of proposal are you instigating?" he teased. "One that," Claude oomphed as he bent over, "requires me to stand on one knee for some reason." Dimitri sighed fondly. He reached out his hands, and Khalid fitted them, holding his palms close. Dimitri crouched on his knees, so he could raise Khalid's fingers to his face. "I love you," Khalid breathed. You are the worst and best thing that ever happened to me. His laughter won't stop. Endless. It rose up for him, a frothy geyser. Would you chance to be my king, Dimitri? He let his laughter bubble forth, loud, unceasing. Why did you let me survive, Khalid? His love burst into an earth-shattering chuckle. I don't know. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Dimitri shook his head. He released Khalid's hands to cup his face, traced the tears in the corner of his eyes. His love's arms wrapped around him, his breaths chasing his own. I am yours. Ever since my reawakening, I have been yours. Your king. Your nobody. Whatever you ask of me, it shall be done. May we remain as one. Khalid let out a strained breath and kissed him. In a year's time they would be wed, and in the flight of fancy, Khalid would invite the newly crowned Empress of Fodlan to visit for the wedding coronation. She would recognize one of the names on the invitation, and she would come. Attendants interspersed with Khalid's siblings helped Dimitri dress for it. He let himself be swaddled in silks and jewels. Tiana von Regan braided back his long hair. It was hours of dressing and fussing, making things that were supposed to be. Dimitri could only imagine. When they reached the dais, and a waiting hand helped him up onto the platform, he asked, Am I handsome, my love? Khalid exhaled slowly. Always. You will have to enjoy it for the both of us. Khalid took him by the wrists, brought his hands to Khalid's attire. Gently, he pinched the flowing layers of cloth, rubbed fabrics between his fingers, traced the faceted gems trekking down each of Khalid's ears. He could hardly keep his head above the farve perpetuating his mind, equal measures pleasurable and frantic. The officiator droned on about nature and healing and the coming together of two souls, of a union he'd never dreamed of, let alone desired before, one that he now craved with all his being. All throughout the procession, the voices, the cheering, the clapping, he trembled. He could only just stammer his way through his vows. And then his mind was numbed by the small, light ring on Khalid's finger, engraved with star-like crevices. Khalid kissed him delicately before what felt like the entire world, from the explosion of an outcry that resulted. Dimitri would recognize her by her scent, lilac, and her footing, heeled shoes that cleanly cut across the floor. When the first wave hit him, he clutched the nearest item in reach and gritted his teeth hard, bracing for the rage to overcome him. But his heart, as it had mellowed, had released the smoldering chains of anger. He found that over the years they had weakened the point of obsolescence. With time and missives from the West, he and Khalid had learned of the Empress's restoration effects, and as they witnessed the church wipe away under her hand, they too experienced the care she had spent in healing what she had cut away, what she called a useless and parasitic appendage. And she could not have caused the tragedy of Dusker, not someone who gave so much of her time to orphans, who spurned the cress-induced classism and tore it apart by her own hands. He learned via missives, under the pen name Keyhole, that Sylvain had survived the war, had done more than survive the war, and now, in paper, it was decreed that he no longer feared having a family. That well-to-do had not been recovered. The rulers in his place had erected laws, backed, and perhaps written, by the Empress in protection of his people. How could he hate someone who had spared his own? Even so, he sensed Khalid's footing, and the hand that came to rest on his shoulder. He shadowed his own hand over Khalid's, fingered his ring. His husband spoke for him. Seems you made it just in time for the feast, your emerence. He was awed at the sound of that. His husband. Khalid. His eyes were moist. He shut them. He then heard them clap, heard her gasp. So this is where you went, Dimitri? What a happy surprise. Somehow, she didn't sound all that shocked. He considered the glances he used to sneak at the Golden Deer leader when he thought no one was looking back to the academy, and flushed. Dimitri held out a hand. Elle. He spoke. He heard her let out a small sound. I hope we may resume as we once more, now that there remains no means for enmity between us. He heard her choke back something in her throat, then the flutter of footsteps as she sprinted to embrace him. He had not hugged her since they were children. They would have to make up for their long, distant years. He found he tired of revenge. Even the thought of it soured on his tongue. Dimitri did not hear her compatriot until she let herself be known. Their old professor reintroduced herself to them, had admitted that the grief post-Grounder had drawn a powerful beast out of hiding, nearly taking out the capital. The remains of the church and empire had united to vanquish the foe. In their aftermath, the professor had been drawn again to Edelgard's vacant side. It was all too much to fit into an afternoon, but he recognized the longing in Edelgard's voice, claimed it as part of himself. It was a miracle that they could all sit around a table, share tea, and tell tales of the war. How Edelgard shook, relieved, at their escape from Grounder. How they all agreed, bitterly, with the seeds of their shared past, that it should have gone differently. But they had little choice during the war. They had all fought for what they believed in, and perhaps, in another world, with ample time and resources, they may have discovered a conclusion without the cost of blood 5 years sooner. But tonight, Dimitri let his lungs breathe in with all their might. He strained to absorb as much of the evening as he could. With an arm around his newly crowned husband and a head on his shoulder, he saw, deep in the well of his soul, the land they had created with their combined labors. He loved it terribly. He would hold fast to it, hands fierce upon the life-giving fountain of their essence, and well past the end of his mortal days.